within a lifetime, no single encounter can compare with the reality of terror.
Everybody, get out!
The perception of Arabs and Muslim in film is defined by three factors: erasure, dualism, and race. Dualism is a major factor in determining how Muslims are portrayed in film. The concept of dualism was originally outlined by Edward Said in his book Orientalism. Edward Said defined Orientalism as an ideology that promotes a West versus Islam dualism, and the idea that others are somehow less than human. This dualism dehumanizes the other and seeks to justify a hierarchical power structure imposed by the West. The idea of dualism and the other, particularly through the lens of terrorism, has been a common theme in American cinema. Terrorism becoming, as Guterman puts it, an essential source of the filmmaking narrative beginning in the 1960s. Terrorism offers exotic sets, international intrigue, graphic violence, and the essential dualistic concept of good versus evil. However, until the 1980s, the evil entity and the terrorist personage were represented very diversely. The terrorist personage could be a Russian, a Nazi, a Serb, a communist. But after the end of the Cold War, communism as the dualistic other stopped being relevant. The archetype of the Arab terrorist took its place, especially after the events of the Munich Olympics and the unsuccessful bombing of the New York Trade Center in 1993. As Guterman eloquently points out, it is crucial to note that Muslim terrorists appear analogous to the way in which the early Nazis and communists used to be represented as characters who not only pose a military threat, but who also challenge the very foundation of national security of the United States, of Western civilization, and the order of the universe as a whole. During this time of the early 1990s Arab terrorists, the archetype of race was heavily emphasized over religion. Samai noticed that the Orientalism as a discourse has been reconstituted in our modern form from its 20th century conception into our 21st century globalized worldview. Globalization has deconstructed Orientalism to a certain extent. Deterritorialization affects the idea of the Orient and Oriental ideals being contained in a geographical location. And interconnectedness has fractured the idea that what happens to others does not affect us. This has changed Orientalism into Neo-Orientalism, wherein dualism is defined by ideology and not by geography. A general rise in religiosity has also contributed to a more dualistic conception of Christianity and Islam as two mutually exclusive universalist worldviews. This dualism through a religious lens is exemplified in President George Bush's statements that he saw American intervention in the Middle East as an ultimately Christian mission. He used language like good versus evil, the axis of evil, and even in a retracted statement as a crusade. The religious identity of the Arab terrorist archetype is much more emphasized in our globalized post-9/11 world. Another component of both Orientalism and Neo-Orientalism is the concept of erasure. Orientalism, as defined by Edward Said, denies any cultural, religious, and ethnic differences in the so-called Orient. According to recently conducted research cited by Guterman, most American movies about Arab terrorists disregard the existence of different schools of thought in Islam. Islam is cast as a monolithic culture in American cinema. Arab and Muslim identities are conflated. All Arabs are Muslim and all Muslims are Arabs. As Samai cites Said, another factor of Orientalism, and therefore Neo-Orientalism, is the conception that the so-called Orient cannot define itself and that white Western voices are more objective and, quote, scientific. The way that Western film industry defines the so-called Orient for itself is through archetypes. Guterman notes that Muslims are either presented as downtrodden masses or as fanatics. This dichotomy is very clear in modern movies such as Argo. The Muslim men are portrayed as dumb and violent, and the women as weak and suppressed, obedient victims. Erasure through Neo-Orientalism not only erases the identity of Christian and Jewish Arabs and non-Arab Muslims, but also erases specific cultural, religious, and socioeconomic contexts that lead to terrorist or Islamic fundamentalist groups. In this model, all Islamic political terrorist groups are essentially the same. Hezbollah is portrayed the same way as Hamas is portrayed the same way as Al-Shabaab, despite the fact that these groups come from specific historical, cultural, and socioeconomic contexts. Many times, Sunni and Shia groups are portrayed the same way. The erasure of context and removal of the complex colonial history of the Middle East in relation to terrorism further portrays the Muslim as the other, with inherently violent traits as part of their cultural personage. The third element in portraying Arabs and Muslims in the film is race. Pre-9/11, the racial identity of the Arab terrorist was pushed over the Muslim identity of the Arab terrorist. This is demonstrable in early 1990s Arab terrorism films, in that brownface is exaggerated. Arabs in these films demonstrate their otherness through their brownness, not through their Islamic identity. They are not carrying Qur'ans or praying in accordance with Islamic tradition to show their otherness. The dualistic nature is deeply racialized. This further demonstrates erasure as a construct. All Muslims are Arabs and demonstrably brown. The arbitrary nature of these racialized archetypes is demonstrable in the fact that in the early 20th century, the quote Muslim archetype was an Ottoman Turk, not an Arab terrorist. Though in 1990s terrorism films, the racial identity of the Arab terrorist archetype is pushed over the religious, due to the goal with terrorist groups being viewed as more political than religious. In the post-9/11 media, the Islamic archetype is pushed. Though the narrative is still heavily racialized and the identity of attackers are still othered through racial markers, the focus on Islamic identity rather than Arab identity not only erases Christian and Jewish Arabs, but allows Neo-Orientalists to claim that their attacks against Middle Eastern people are about religion rather than race. This discourse is mostly used by white male atheist leaders. With very few exceptions, European Muslims are rarely depicted on screen, despite the fact that a large portion of Eastern Europe is Muslim. Erasure of European Muslim identity is demonstrable in the case of the Boston bombers. When the first pictures of the Tsarnaev brothers were released, many commentators stated, "They are not Muslim, they are white." Despite the existence of European Muslims, and even though a much publicized American terrorist attack was perpetrated by Eastern Europeans, the terrorist archetype remains racialized, particularly Arabized. This is demonstrable of the erasure of diversity within the Muslim community. Despite Islam being the most racially diverse religion in the world, the archetype remains within a much racialized space, where brownness is the most prevalent marker. To be Middle Eastern in America is to be automatically assumed Muslim.